hope you're all in good spirits. My name is Victor Cannet, and if you're joining us for the first time, I want to say welcome. This is the right place for you to be. Now, I want to start by saying this will be a bit of an apology, but at the same time, it's also just a reflection. When we started this platform, I had different kinds of series that I was running. But one of the series was about, I called it the psychology of different cultures, where I did a snapshot of different cultures. And just to explain some of the psychology that might help us understand the culture and the people from there. And I think it was fun. And then over time, I had different things demanding for my attention, and I was not able to finish it. But it's interesting how I've received a lot of comments on those particular series, especially the video that I made on Poland. And I've visited Poland a number of times, and it was also from personal experience, but at the same time also based on the things that I've also read about the people and also the experience that I've had. And so I've made time to do some video, drop some video, just to capture some of the psychologies that shape or inform why people from different countries or cultures behave a certain way. And I think I still want to bring that back. And so I want to start today by talking about a different country and be very intentional about producing contents that can help us understand people from different cultures and help us understand why they act a certain way and what really generally influence how they carry themselves. And so for today, I do want to talk about South Africa. Now, I think I'm not sure I've made any video on South Africa yet. So I want to start by talking about South Africa today. Now, South Africa, as we know, is very culturally diverse. If you've not visited the place, I think I would encourage you to do so. It's a beautiful country as well. And I think its psychology is heavily influenced by its complex history, particularly the impact of, I always struggle pronouncing the word, what is apartheid, but you know what I mean, which of course has the collective and individual identities of the people in this country across racial, cultural, and even socioeconomic lines. I've also personally lived in South Africa. In fact, I did my graduate studies in South Africa, my master's there. I also pastored in South Africa in a color community in Stellenbosch. And so I, to some degree, understand South Africa, if that makes sense. Living there as an outsider, studying there at the same time, also pastoring people over there. So I do kind of understand, to some degree, the culture. But beyond just my personal experience, I think also some of the philosophies that also inform this particular culture, I like to learn some of that, especially when we think about the psychology of South African people. I think would be the idea of collectivism, and some would say Ubuntu, which the Ubuntu philosophy, which is very pronounced within, if you will, psychology or sociology, or when you talk about African philosophy, I see a lot of people just throw out Ubuntu as though it's one philosophical principle that informs the whole of Africa. But Ubuntu is a South African or Southern African philosophy. Other cultures within Southern Africa also have their own similar concept. But particularly among the Black communities, Black South Africans, they embrace this idea of Ubuntu, which is the philosophy that I am because we are, right? It's a collectivist mindset that values the idea of family, interconnectedness. It values things like support, and has that communal element to that, right? And this orientation, of course, we'll also find it in psychology. We could talk about it from the lens of social identity theory, for example, which suggests that individuals kind of derive part of their self-concept from their group affiliations. Now, this also means that people within South Africa find their identity, purpose, and well-being through this idea of interconnectedness or connections with their family, with their community, and with their culture. And as you would imagine, it would have unique impact on people's mental health, because community support on one hand serves as a great buffer against stress and mental health issues, because social bonds that is formed within this context and shared values, they are prioritized over individual success. And if that is the case, if you're plugged in such communities, whether or not you're successful, it's not a criteria for your well-being. So far you are within the community, which is why you find people, they love to drink together, they love to party together. In South Africa, there's something that's called, I'm trying to remember, when you do a barbecue, I don't know why I forgot the word, braai, I think that's what the word is called, braai or something like that. So it's a time where people come together, you do barbecue, you sort of roast chicken or whatever. It's usually a fun time. So that idea of connectedness is very important in South African culture. But also we can't ignore the historical trauma and the resilience of the South African people. As you would imagine, apartheid had left a lasting psychological impact on almost all South African communities, and the legacy of apartheid in itself created this long-lasting psychological effect had led to things like generational trauma, which kind of impact communities as they reflect and have memories, and they reflect on the memories of injustice and the oppression that they faced. The legacy of this trauma continues to manifest even till today, right, in issues of generational trauma, and even you see that also filtering in people's mistrust of authorities. Some parts of South Africa are almost the most dangerous places to go to. In fact, when I was living in South Africa, I was living in a place called Stellenbosch, but there was a township. So a township, it's usually a word that is used to refer to where you have the ghetto, if you will, where you have people living in shacks. But most of the people living there are usually blacks, unfortunately, black South Africans. So I was living in a place called Stellenbosch. And from Stellenbosch to the closest township there, it's not more than 5 minutes drive. But all the time I lived there, I never went to the place. Why? Because of the violence in the place. You could literally be walking up on the street without really finding anyone's trouble or just minding your business, and you get stabbed and you're robbed or something. So it can be very dangerous to go to certain parts of South Africa. And the reason for that is because of this trauma. In psychology, we use trauma theory to help us understand how generational trauma can impact people's mental health. And we have symptoms like things like hypervigilance or anxiety or even mistrust of authorities. And if you go to those townships, you find that this is what's happening. It's largely as a result of a generational trauma. And there's a lot of history surrounding this. Part of that would be, there was a story that for some South Africans, when the Dutch settlers had come into the place and employed some of the colored and the black population communities to work in their farms, they were giving them alcohol. Some would say, I don't know how true this is, some would say that they intentionally made them to get addicted to alcohol and liquor as a way of getting them entrapped. And what this means is that almost in all families, in all of the black families working in those farms, either the father is always drunk, and to the point at the end of the month, they would prefer that they are paid with liquor than actually with, the actual salary. This is what I heard when I was living there among some of the colored communities and families. And so you find that there is a dysfunction in almost any family. And so this generational trauma does impact people's mental health to the point that you find that in people becoming hypervigilant. So when you go to the safe havens, the place where this poor, low-income communities, whether it's a black community or the colored community where they live, there's usually high violence over there. And of course, if you're an outsider that's trying to come into the place, you're seen as a threat, right? There's some kind of anxiety that causes the people. And also there's a mistrust of an outsider who is often perceived as an intruder. And that mistrust kind of also lingers into how they also see their mistrust for authorities. But I think why that is the case, at the same time, I think resilience has been sort of a key factor that we see in adapting to South Africa, because community and family networks within South Africa kind of provide a source of resilience for most of those people. And this has helped people to find strength and meaning after surviving adversity through apartheid. And so this resilience, I think, would help people in most cases adapt and find hope despite the challenging history that they have. The other thing I think that largely shaped the psychology of South African people will be the idea of spirituality and healing systems, where spirituality is sort of seen as a fundamental healing system within the country. Now, you see this emphasis in a lot of books. One that I would recommend will be the book it's called Under the Canopy. It's an anthropological book that was written by an American scholar who visited Cape Town and participated in some of the African indigenous churches in Cape Town, and wrote a book about how religion and spirituality or religious ritual within those spaces became a form of healing system. And ordinarily, because for those people, they're not able to have access to resources or healthcare services that would take care of them. So they rely on religious spiritual spaces or on spirituality to cater for their needs, their health needs. And so South Africans often blend traditional beliefs with other religions, things like whether it's a Christianity, Islam, Hinduism. They do that with a strong respect for the Sangomas, which are regarded as their traditional leader, which these people play a very important, crucial role in their health. And part of that could also be, as I mentioned, that most of these people don't have access to healthcare, state of the art healthcare, especially if they're coming from low income households, right? On the other hand, it's been also the fact that over time, there is a history to this because around the time of apartheid, now most people going to the hospital is a second thought for them. And so they rely on these traditional healers to help them through that they're battling with. And of course, beyond just the health context. Now, I think this is very important because in psychology, the idea of biopsychosocial model, it's very much central in how we interpret or conceptualize health because it's kind of views health holistically in such that it incorporates whether it's a biological, psychological, even social element. And so many South Africans see their mental health as something that is influenced by both spiritual and social elements. And these are all sort of integrated into their healing practices. And so I think both traditional practices and community rituals are often very important to people's emotional well-being in South Africa. And it's also seen as effective by those that value them. Why do they value them? Whether or not that, at least there's some research that show evidence that religious and spiritual rituals do associate with well-being outcomes, but also they do value this. And if they value that, who am I to say that it's not of no use to them? But essentially, this creates sort of a culturally resonant form of support. And if this is the case, how can we sustain such practices or strengthen such practices or even support those practices to enable their flourishing? On the other hand, I think, and so this resilience would help people in most cases adapt and find hope despite the challenging history that they have. The other thing I think largely shaped the psychology of South African people will be the idea of spirituality and healing systems, where spirituality is seen as a fundamental healing system within the country. You see this emphasis in books. One that I would recommend, a book it's called Under the Canopy. It's important to also talk about racial and ethnic identity in South Africa as part of the thing that forms the psychology of South Africa. In fact, I used to say this, if you go to South Africa, you would literally almost see people of any race that are South Africans. You will find Indian South Africans. You'll find Chinese South Africans. You'll find white South Africans. You'll find, of course, black South Africans. You would find, what are the other groups? You'll find Jewish South Africans. And so almost in South Africa, it's a melting pot of the world in some sense. Now, I think South Africa's diversity, this means that racial and ethnic identities are really crucial and critical parts of both individual and community identity. And these are the things that shape the experiences and the worldview of people in those spaces. And why is this important? I think on one hand, it is important because it helps in South Africa identity and ethnicity, or racial identity and ethnicity. It's a thing that we can't ignore. People categorize themselves and others into groups in South Africa. And of course, this impacts how they view themselves and others. And of course, this idea is consistent with social identity theory, where you find that classification of people into different groups. For example, you have the blacks, you have the whites, you have the colored, you have the Indian community, and of course, there are other minority communities within this group as well. Now, within the white community, you have the British South African, you have the Dutch South Africans, and the list keeps going on. And so racial and ethnic identity, of course, due to lasting effect, does influence everything in South Africa, from social status even to people's. And of course, this overall has an effect on the self-perception that South Africans have of themselves. For many of them, their racial identity largely influences their mental health, either by fostering pride because their race is considered as a bit of privilege with it, and so it might be pride for them, or maybe it might be a sense of solidarity, especially for some who have feelings of marginalization due to their racial identity. And so this ongoing complexity continues to affect the daily life and interactions of people in modern day South Africa. The other point I think it's important to talk about that we can just ignore is the fact that social inequality is also a very key factor in South Africa. Now, I think why is this important to talk about this? I don't know if you know about it or you've visited South Africa, but South Africa has one of the highest levels of income inequality globally, with wealth disparities often following racial lines. Now, if this is the case, given the fact that South Africa has a very high level of income inequality, of course, you would imagine that this would impact the way people have access to whether it's health resources or resources in general. Now, I think it's Maslow that Maslow's hierarchy of needs suggests that without basic needs, things like financial stability and security, higher level needs like mental health and self-actualization are almost difficult to achieve. So if people are not able to have access to the basic needs, whether it's finance, whether it's housing, whether it's security, if they're not able to have those, it's almost impossible to attain higher level need, things like self-actualization. Now, of course, this has an impact on people because economic stress can lead to mental health issues like anxiety and depression. And for those with limited access to resources, managing stress becomes really a daily challenge, especially some of the neighborhoods are still segregated, which of course leads to resource distribution. In fact, from Stellenbosch to, I'm trying to remember the name of the place, the township that I'm talking about, it's just about 5 minutes drive or less than that. But the disparity in the spatial disparity between these two places, it's dumbfounding. Of course, this does impact the extent to which people living in the townships are able to achieve self-actualization. But also another important issue I wanted to talk about as well, it's xenophobia and intergroup relations in South Africa. Now, of course, for those of you that are not familiar with the concept of xenophobia, it is the fear or the dislike of a foreigner. And it's been a pressing issue in South Africa almost on a daily basis recently for the past 5 years, particularly towards immigrants from other African countries. And of course, in psychology, we can sort of explain this by using realistic conflict theory, which posits that prejudice usually arises when groups compete over scarce resources. So when people have their scarce resources, there's a tendency for prejudice to become the hallmark of interaction between different groups. And so due to economic hardship and unemployment, which is at the highest point throughout South African history, some South Africans, there's a tendency that they would view immigrants or all of their African brothers and sisters as a competition. And of course, as a result of that, it would intensify the distrust and the hostility within the country. Now, I think xenophobia really does affect both locals and immigrants because it does not just affect the migrants themselves, but also the locals, the South Africans, the Black South Africans, and which of course lead to heightened tension. It also leads to things like social distrust and violence. And when violence becomes the norm in a society, of course, there's a tendency not to get investors. And also, when you destroy your city, you don't rebuild it in a day. It takes time. In fact, this is something that I've seen also when I lived in South Africa, where a slight of any disagreement, people go on the street and they start to break things, they start to burn things down, they start to destroy properties. And these are properties that's been built that took years and decades to build, right? And so I think that this xenophobia fosters sort of a psychological climate of fear, anxiety, and defensiveness within communities, which of course impact both in-group and out-group relationships, which is why today South Africa is still grappling with that. I don't think that they've made much progress with building relationships beyond just a particular group. And it's still something that I fear for the future of South Africa when I think about that a bit more, because I think that the people of South Africa have not yet reconciled with their past. And I think that's still very much informing and shaping their future. Lastly, I want to talk about urbanization and globalization, which in some ways has shaped or changed the traditional ways of life, which, as you would imagine, would lead to some kind of clash between traditional values and Western influences. For young people in particular, though, there's this tension trying to balance between their traditional values and the demands of modern globalized life. This has an impact on youth identity because this dual exposure to both traditional values and modern life can create some kind of identity struggles, especially for South African youths who might want to represent themselves in a way that is a move away from the traditional representational system. Some of them may thrive in blended cultures, both of their traditional and modern cultures. Of them may also face the pressure to choose one identity over another. This would ultimately lead to psychological stress and tension in itself, especially family tension. And so all those challenges becomes really fundamental when you start to think about the psychology of South African people. There's still mental health stigma as well, which remains prevalent, particularly in poor communities and households, and even in rural areas where there is limited access to mental health services, and usually due to cost. And not just that, this could also be due to the labels as well that's placed around us, because people who seek mental health help may be viewed negatively, which of course to some degree deters them from accessing those services. On the other hand, it might not necessarily be due to the stigma that's attached to mental health. It could also be because these people don't have access or knowledge that they even have access to these services, or may not have the resources or even the healthcare financial resources to these services. And so whatever that's being done, I think to understand South Africa in itself, it's important. It means really trying to understand the different complex ways in which all these different factors intersect to shape, what I call it, the psychological landscape of the people and the ways that people in South Africa seek healing and resilience. But I think despite these challenges, South Africans do have a very strong resilience through their community connections, using the philosophy, especially when you think about the philosophy of Ubuntu. And also, I think they have resilience through their adaptive coping mechanisms, which are some of the things I've mentioned earlier. And so this idea of post-traumatic growth, in some sense, shows or tells us how South Africans often find new meaning and even strength and personal growth after their trauma, that it's tied to apartheid. And of course, this trauma would, to some degree, help most South Africans experience cultural pride in spite of the challenges that they are facing. And so I think that collective resilience becomes very fundamental, especially when you think about South Africa and what the future might hold for them. But that's all for now as we think about South Africa and the psychology of African people. And let me know which country you would like me to cover next. But in the meantime, I hope that you have a wonderful time. This is Victor Counted, and this is the psychology of different cultures. You take care and all the best. Bye.